it's not important that you got 10%, 7%, 25% or numbers. What is important is what kind of research has been produced and how this research has contributed to the overall questions, to the overall challenge.
You can't design progress the way you build a machine by tightening bolts and ignoring the passengers inside. That's what Europe risks when its research agenda treats society as an afterthought, rather than a co-architect of innovation. For decades, that's how Europe has often treated research and innovation. We perfect the technologies, the frameworks, the funding instruments, while the societies they are meant to serve are consulted late, lightly, or not at all. In this episode of The Insider, we sit right on that fault line. Together with Dr. Gabi Lombardo, Director of the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities, we ask a simple but uncomfortable question. What happens when society becomes an afterthought in Europe's research agenda? And what would it take to put it back at the centre? This is not a conversation about adding a checkbox to calls. It's about redesigning the house while we're still living in it. Let's get inside.
Welcome back to The Insider. I'm Ricardo Miguéis, and you've joined us in Season 2, where we explore not just the machinery of European research and innovation, but the tectonic shifts beneath it. This season is about transformation. It's about transformation in a political sense, ecological, technological, and also epistemological. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves about science, about society, and about the systems we build in their name. So in this episode, we ask a question that sits right at the fault line of European research and innovation strategy. What happens when society becomes an afterthought in the way that we fund, govern, and evaluate research? And more urgently, what would it take to reverse that, to put societies back at the center of the European research agenda? So to answer that, I'm joined by someone who has been building both the critique and the architecture for that reversal. Dr. Gabi Lombardo, Director of the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities, and one of the most systemically literate voices in the policy space today. Gabi has shaped debates across institutions and has been a leading force behind efforts to embed social science and humanities in the design of FP10 and previous framework programs. I was there to witness it. This episode has two parts. In the first, we explore the narrative foundation, so Gabi's journey, the system failures she's seen up close, and how she thinks we got there. In the second part, we dive into the strategic depth, the policies, the funding mechanisms, and the metrics that are either enabling or constraining SSH's role in European research and innovation. So let's begin. Gabi, it is so good to have you here with me in The Insider.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me a voice.
That is a pleasure and an honor, all on my side. And as always, here in The Insider, I want to start with not with the policies, but with the person and the motivations and the reasoning behind it all. So you have an amazing trajectory. We've known each other for many years now, and I would like to explore with you here what were the intellectual and the institutional turning points in your life that shaped your belief that Europe needs to reimagine its research agenda around society and not just around technology. And you've worked in several institutions, but you also built this European Alliance for SSH from the ground up. So what moments, experiences convinced you that SSH was not just underfunded, was not just about budgets, but was misunderstood?
Well, thank you, Ricardo. And I suppose I'm a child of the London School of Economics in many ways. I did my PhD there. I worked the first 10 years of my career at the LSE. And I learned from people that I really regarded as pillars of not just intellectual, but pillar of society. Anthony Giddens, Peter Townsend, Conor Gertie, who just recently passed away. Those characters, Richard Layard, those people have not just impacted the intellectual life, their peers, their stories, but they are deeply rooted in the way how we understand society today. Tony Giddens was the philosopher of the third way, influencing part of the early days of the Tony Blair politics. Peter Townsend was the first one to set up a center for poverty when we thought that poverty was simply there and we didn't need data for it. And Conor Gertie was an activist of science. He's the first center of human rights. This experience have been fundamental shape what I believe, who I am, and in many ways, all my work so far, and not just my work. So this is the background.
And that's a fantastic background. I mean, I remember the influence that Anthony Giddens had in Tony Blair, end of 90s, essentially, and it was amazing to witness it. I was there too, but there is something in us that makes us shift from working in institutions to actively trying to shape them. What was it in your case?
Well, maybe it's connected with, definitely with the Alliance, but it's connected with how we understand that the research is for. So historically, when we came out of the Second World War, the whole focus was around economic growth. And we need a new technology as a magic wand. We didn't know what it would do, but it might have been a magic wand. As we grow older, and not just physically, but as a society, as we grow, as we move forward, we realize there's a very important shaping force, which is us, people. And we never give it enough attention, or not as much attention as a research does, a research in social science humanities does to people. And they are intrinsic to the way how our society is shaped. And sometimes we tend to take it for granted or not even associate to it. But I think it is really critical. And so changing the system from a system designed for research needed in the 1960s to a system needed for research in 2100. There is a space for redesign, reimagine, transform, but deeply change, profoundly, as you said, reimagine how the system should look like.
Well, that takes me to a quote of your paper, the latest paper, because the European Alliance for SSH writes deep analysis and insights as well, and proposals of how to look at all of this, and that is something outstanding because it is difficult. It is a difficult exercise, and in one of the latest papers I have here with me, called "Society in FP10 Proposal is for Research on Society," you write, SSH disciplines are at the center of understanding the problems of our time. Now, I know this might seem a common statement, but what do you think are the structural reasons that this insight has struggled to translate into program design for so many years?
Let me start from where EASSH comes from. So the European Alliances for Social Science and Humanities, which is I'm honored to serve, has been very much a movement from researchers. It started with 100,000 signatures when Horizon 2020 totally lost or forgot to have a challenge on society completely. And many researchers really mobilized themselves, so they organized themselves, and they created the Alliance. The Alliance is very young, relatively, so we have set up in a real motion in 2017, so it doesn't have a long life. but was a really needed movement. It needed a voice that was totally missing in the science and technology studies in general. The science and technology study for many years have been a real focus on the development of technology, what is the latest, what's happening on the bioscience. Where we needed a really different approach. So the Alliances is very much tied in with the needs that we have today in terms of a fundamental research and knowledge evidence to redesign the type of society we're living in. We can go more in depth on a different stage, but this is a very much interlinked and intertwined. And give a voice to researchers. They are deeply engaged with understanding our values and our society, our human behavior is critical to design a new science policy, a new investment in research, which does not have a one side.
But this is what drives the Alliance. But I really would like to go a little bit deeper into the reasons that when we are developing a research question for funding a work program, we struggle so much in including social sciences and humanities. Like just from what contextualizes this?
Yes, this has both. I'm an historian by training, an economic historian, and this has an historical reason. The European funding altogether cover something between 5 and 7% of the overall investment in research in Europe. Now, why is that? Because most of the research is funded at the member states level. The design of the member states' investment in research is based on premises that the OECD set up in the 60s. And this was very much focused on technical and engineering, techno knowledge, economic growth perspective in a very narrow definition of that. So social science humanities has been funded over the 60 years, very much bottom up. So in a kind of big scatter way with a very limited investment, creating a plethora of researchers working on several different things and similar also topics, but at individual basis, because the funding were not allowed to scale. And as the European Framework Programme is very much a mirror image of what the member states' pathway is, and tend to pick up a lot from the member states' directives. Obviously, social science humanities remain on very relatively small size. I give you a very practical example. Even in the case of ERC, which is a much younger product in the framework program, when ERC was set up, the 3 domains were fought for. Helga Nowotny really put a massive effort to have a 3rd domain called the social science humanities. And the collective decision was that the only way to have a budget for SSH was if it was a ring fence. And the average budget that they could come up with was about 14%. Compared to the other 2 domains that obviously cover the rest. As we gone by, changes in the structure of ERC, which means that they change the budget that must be allocated bottom up. That means on demand, on the basis of the project received. Today, SSH represents almost a third of the funding. But this is only because we changed the structure. On the basis of what it was set up originally, it just mirror what the member states were doing with a relatively much smaller allocation of funding for this type of research. And so we have a problem of scale there, which actually reiterates. And also we had a completely lack of voice in the discussion, the debate. So the European Alliance of Social Science and Humanities is the largest umbrella organization in Europe. But to be very honest, it's also the only one. And that's obviously makes us proud, but also makes it very difficult to have our point forward, because we are the sole voice. And we're still battling on two fronts. On one hand, to the policymakers for the visibility of these scatter points across Europe. We have a scholarship, a number of scholars, which is almost a third of the overall scientific community. But there are so many little dots that are difficult to be seen from the larger perspective of Europe. And even worse, of being heard. And from the community side, they have been funded in such a scattered way. They struggle and create a critical mass. We have thousands of behavior labs. They're all funded with very small funding, never reach a scale. And they all work with different methods, different guidelines, different structures, which makes it also difficult to create a scale in terms of result. And we also encourage the community to come together, but they don't have incentives. They don't have the reason to do it because, again, they keep being funded on a very small scale. Not just a small scale, a bottom-up scale. So, for example, we have a partnership at the moment of brain health, and there's never, ever been everywhere in any of the OECD countries a research or strategy on brain health, which is mainly driven by social science, humanities type of research. So in the partnership, we obviously have this kind of imbalance where there are some bioscientists that have been funded with billions over 20 years systematically aligned on the same priorities, whereas the social scientists have been funded with much smaller funding and therefore much more scattered type of result with different methods and different results and different achievements.
I mean, let me unpack some of those things a little bit further because it's very interesting what you said about the national dimension, which is responsible for the majority of the funding at European level. Across the EU, if we put it, about, as you said, about 95% of the funding for research and innovation comes from the national level. I mean, the numbers vary, but it's 1% less, 1% more. And you said that there is this mirroring effect from the European design of the programs from the national. So automatically what comes into my mind is not an issue only about scale, it's an issue about why is it so, and is it related with the structure of scientific development. Also historically, as an historian, I'm sure that you can appreciate that path dependency from the big science tradition, for example. And that's the first question. The second question that came into my mind was when you were talking about this comparison of budgets between one and the other, when I think that what matters here is not so much the absolute amounts, because, I mean, obviously technological research is much more expensive than SSH, but is really the way that the interplay between SSH and other non-SSH domains think together to come up with the questions, the root questions, and also in the development of that research, the lack of critical thinking loops about the research itself that is being done, and the lack of integration with SSH in that process is something that we simply seem to not know how to do.
Yeah, I see where. Well, first of all, I need to make a little, not a correction, but point on something.
No, go ahead.
The SSH research, which is traditionally has been, as you say, less expensive. This has changed massively in the last 15 years. What we don't understand is the impact of technology did not just impact on some hard sciences. It impacted enormously on social science and humanities. The big data sites require no less funding, or behavior labs require no less funding than any other technical science or biotechnical science or biology. There are disciplines that are more relying on larger labs, but SSH is building large labs, and behavior being one case, for example, but we have got many other cases. big data completely transforms the way we work. You will never find that today a psychologist who work in a room. They work with an MRI in an hospital, with the difference that the Department of Psychology cannot afford an MRI. So they needed to pay the rent to the medical faculty, pay people to be trained not to look for tumor, but to look for cells interactions. So let's be clear that today the way how we fund the research has no distinction between technology, life science, or social science humanities. We are living in a revolution of science and the way we do science, which affect all disciplines exactly in the same way. Take history of art. Can you work on history of art without having a scanner? Today is impossible. And so we don't have archaeology. Can you excavate the sites without...
But that's exactly my point, Gabi. Sorry, but this is exactly my point. I mean, we think we are very much aligned here. It's that this interplay. So we go into this interplay, right? Of that we simply do not know how to do in an adequate manner. Because you're talking about history of art, there is a huge dimension of interplay with bioengineering in history of art. I mean, medicines have been found by people who were analyzing paintings and then trying to recover them. So
exactly,
I think this interplay and this very I would say very this rift, this very very structured manner of looking at the disciplines seems to me to be at the core of the problem, really.
Yeah, and in fact, I was getting to your questions, because actually the problem is not the interdisciplinary does not happen in reality. Where it actually failed to happen is at the science policy level, and this is exactly my point. And that's what I'm trying to say. There is not that the researcher has not catch up with time. It's the science policy makers that have not catch up with the reality or the way we do science together. And I still have to hear say, oh yeah, but social science humanities, it doesn't cost as much. You know, it's a really interesting to see how policymakers still have not quite understood the dynamics of how you do research today. And so one of the, you mentioned integrations that we have been trying to, the Commission has been trying to for years. But in Horizon 2020 was the first time where the SSH integration had a specific definition. And Horizon Europe actually is the very first program where integration is considered as a critical principle and will now be reconfirmed in FP10. The point is that the implementation failed to happen because for as long as we continue to trying to integrate, trying to squeeze in that notion of the other notion of social science humanities, or even on a bigger scale, we are doing some data analysis on integration. And for example, in climate change, there's a lot of interaction which is being captured by the goals defined in Horizon Europe. In health, there is a huge contribution on humanities, social sciences research, but it's not at all captured by the goals. So it's really a policy design that is needed to be updated to capture the type of research we're doing today and the way we are doing research today. And this is still quite far behind. And this is also intrinsically, for example, for Horizon Europe has been, Horizon 2020 had some expert to advising how to do this combination of research questions, how to address research questions from these different angles, how to address a specific research question in an integrated bigger challenge. But the Commission decided that they were not listening to them and therefore they were not needed in Horizon Europe. So we don't have them. Will it have in the next framework program 10? I don't know. We've been campaigning for that. But so far, the response has been pretty lukewarm. The other things have been a non-prescriptive calls, which I agree with. But we need to also have the tools to address non-prescriptive calls.
Yes.
And at the moment, I don't see any in place, at least.
That's very interesting. I'd like to come back to that. But it just reminded me that in the latest EARTO summit, our CEO from INESC Tech, one of the institutes I represent, said, João Claro, he said something along the lines that we seem to not only have a death valley between knowledge production and knowledge uptake, but a death valley in science policy. So it kind of aligns with you. So it kind of proves that people are aligned in the research and innovation system. And in you have a paper called SSH Integration Analysis, and you noted that nearly 40% of projects flagged for SSH had no or weak integration. What does that reveal about the limits of integration as a model for you?
Yeah, but the way this is a link to the implementation of integration in Horizon Europe and also in Horizon 2020 to an extent. In the paper that we're going to publish this week, so it's not out yet, we have our own data analysis on how integration could be read. We know we have research done that people working in a multidisciplinary project that tend then to publish in their own disciplinary journals. And it's the nature of research, because obviously that's how they also progress their career. We then did a data analysis on publications coming up from flat topics, so multidisciplinary projects, where the research is funded. Why did we do that? Because it's not important that you got 10%, 7%, 25% or numbers. What is important is what kind of research has been produced and how this research has contributed to the overall questions, to the overall challenge.
Yeah.
And we actually identified the flagged topic, which is to encourage integration, is important because at least make consortia to ask which questions are we missing, because the call doesn't say that. The call simply say integrate SSH, which is not enough. And then the researcher said, okay, so what does that mean? And they go back to expert researchers and say, how can you contribute to that? Of course, the question is very big and general, and there are several different ways like you can contribute to a project. So what is important to identify is not so much the percentage of funding, which is totally relevant, but rather the actual contribution of one discipline into another. And to be honest, I see SSH integration as a keyhole to understand the multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. And we found out that at the moment, so far, the integrations, I said if you want to call it that way, but the number of publications in percentage varies from a top 7% of SSH publication in climate change, for example, to a very low 2% in health. This is not a mirror image of the way how researchers are working. It's just an image of how the goals have been designed, but also how they've been evaluated and how they eventually were implemented.
Very, very interesting. And I'm sure we're going to go back to that on part 2 of our conversation. You've also spoken about the Frascati manual problem. Why is that technical document such a central barrier for SSH recognition in your view?
This goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We have designed in the 1960s a system which was from funding research very much led by research understanding. So researchers were setting up the research agenda to a system which has been more moved towards responding to national priorities, which had its own values, particularly in the 60s, where we overcome the issues of the Second World War, and we needed to rebuild countries. So had a perfect, viable logic. The OECD set up a framework, and UNESCO to an extent was a counterpart, but a little bit an antithesis to that. Which was based on an accounting system. So how do we decide to distribute research? we needed to have some kind of accounting. Well, let's see what kind of research we do. And of course, the Frascati manual, but up to the 2015, so we're not talking about ancient history, we're talking about long past dependency of that, set up as a research ventures, the most visible, which in the 60s were the bigger biolab, for example, or the emerging big lab for technology. Of course, research in humanities and social sciences did not have that kind of a scale, and in particular, some of the current type of research that we do in social science humanities, like longitudinal studies, for example, or marketing research, didn't exist at the time, and never anyway penetrated the understanding in this accounting system. Now, changing accounting system which is implemented at national level is a big job. And therefore, once the accounting system is set, it's very, very hard to make substantial changes. Frascati reiteration over the years have been a bit more inclusive of some type of research that social science humanities mainly focus on. But still a long way to go. And at a certain point, even for innovation was not really captured by some of the parameters of the Frascati manual. And the Oslo manual tried to create a measuring or some indicators to understand innovation better.
Do you think that that means that Europe's conception of excellence, which is used everywhere, has become detached from questions of societal legitimacy or even policy utility?
Well, I think that the research excellence is very much tied in with the way how we assess research. As you know better than anybody else, so we have a very important movement at the moment, the COARA, the Coalition for the Reform of Research Evaluation, which is extremely important because it's shifting the attention from, let's say, a game of publishers, if you want to put it that way, but what has been legitimately understood as the main output of research, which were articles, into understand what research could be for and how does influence, help, support, develop our societies. Indicators are still not quite clear. We have several working groups, about 14 working groups working in COAR at the moment, looking on different dimensions. And we had the DORA movement for a very long time, which was very much focused on the principles of integrating other type of metrics into the way we evaluate the research. What COAR is doing, though, is shifting towards the implementation and the practical use of these changes. So, okay, in principle, we know that publications don't tell the whole story. What do we do next? And COAR is trying to focus on what do we do next? What do we need next? Oddly enough, social science humanities have been evaluating research away from the metrics in some disciplines, a bit more closer for others, so it's very uneven. But they have a toolbox which can be extremely helpful. And we've been working also on our own issues. So find out and trying to define some parameters which are not standards, not everybody does the same, but it's been more tailor-made to what the discipline actually are best at delivering. And delivering not just for economic growth understood in terms of GDP, which got its own issues and problems, but influence and design and develop a society and support a society in its best endeavors.
Yeah. Well, Gabi, there's a lot to unpack, and we're going to do that in the second part of our podcast, where we're going into the strategic depth. So I'm going to shift us into that second part, where we're going to go deeply into FP10 and how social sciences and humanities appear in the form of a society policy window and what that means. And also about, we're going to talk about resilience and about how resilience, how you see resilience, which is going to be an interesting part of the conversation as well, and then relate that and continue with metrics as well, which is going to be where we're going to go a little bit more in depth on this beyond GDP kind of alternative metric system, and the concrete ways in which these Frascati or even the Oslo manuals can be updated for the future. So we're going to go into in depth into what we have been discussing now. I think it has been an excellent first part. Let's shift us into the second part. So, Gabi, welcome to the second part of the podcast, Strategic Depth, and we're going to start talking about FP10. FP10 is in the making. And as I said before, social sciences and humanities, they are appearing again in the form of a policy window called society. So the overall question here is, what would it take for FP10 to treat SSH as a co-designer of missions? We go back to that interplay conversation that we just had, and not just as a kind of a, how shall I put it, a commentator on the impact of the missions. So to contextualize that, I'd like to go back again to your September 2025 paper, where you wrote that the society window is currently framed as research on society, but SSH is also crucial for designing research and innovation that responds to social needs. So what's missing structurally to make that shift? Is it about leadership, about review panels? You've mentioned a little bit about also evaluation, or how topics are drafted. I have to say that this is very close to my experience when I was in the Horizon 2020 I don't know, SSH Gate, let's put it that way, and as a national delegate, and I was trying to talk to in a meeting of delegates in a program committee, saying to the commission, well, no, this is not yet SSH, because you are not considering SSH in the root thinking of the problems that we are trying to address in this specific area. So why hasn't this changed? What is missing?
You're listening to The Insider, Season 2. Last season we reached thousands across Europe and 58% of our listeners tuned in but didn't subscribe. Well, here it is. This season we're bringing the architects of Europe's R&I system, the thinkers, the builders, the ones shaping Europe's R&I future from the inside. So, subscribe now and tell us in the comments, who should we bring inside next?
Well, first of all, is missing voices like yours, reminding people of where the missing points are, that's for sure. And to be frank with you, it looks like society has been kind of dropped at the last minute in this proposal because it has no details. This one, which is the only window, policy window, programs, there are different names has been given to this space, which remains outside of the competitive fund. This is already tells you something, how society is understood. And not only society in terms of research on democracy, which considering outside the competitive fund is, to say the least, bizarre. But even research on, for example, the service industry, which is basically what employs almost 80% of people in Europe. So obviously, all of us, I'm sorry, 80% of us are really wasting our time and they are not making Europe competitive, clearly. And an healthy society is definitely something that you would have thought made productive people. But of course, even that is not considered as an element of competitiveness, pretty much. So this is a first comment that I can do. Second comment is, our understanding, and from the proposals, pretty clear that society, which is the smallest session, the smallest window of this pie into competitive societies, can be understood as investing in research on society. We have a very important societal challenges. So the window is divided in three parts: the societal challenges, missions, and the new European Bauhaus. Societal challenges are very important in democracy, education, which has never been funded at European level. Research on education has never been receiving funding. Or important research on, for example, area studies. What's happening in China, what's happening in the US today. This type of research has never been done. But also research on culture. And we've been funding cultural heritage. But we haven't funded culture and identity with as much. So it's really important questions. And how our societies transform, change, going to this productive mode, being more inclusive, understanding social cohesion. So these are all very critical societal challenges, which with the budget of society at the moment, which is about 7.6 billion, of which obviously, as I said, they're not all for societal challenges, but a good proportion we've got societal challenges, could be even considered viable. But of course, societal challenges are not just in these areas. We know we have a societal challenge on climate change, for example. But all of a sudden, the whole policy window referring to clean energy and so does not have any space for this societal challenge of climate change. Or we know that we got very serious societal challenge in health, but this doesn't seem to be societal challenge in the health policy window. So where this integration is going to happen, or is maybe misunderstood. I misunderstood the whole story, and we are addressing all the societal challenge of the world into the 7 billion, including biodiversity, I don't know, you name it, hydrogen, maybe, I don't know. It is, so the design of the framework program is erasing some questions and nothing else. I think it would be critical to integrate the societal challenge across all the policy windows, particularly because if we think how the policy windows under competitive fund are being designed to be intertwined with the co-funding of the European competitive fund. Now, we all know, especially people working in your field, there doesn't exist a process of innovation. They start with the lab and finish in a company. And we know the research is needed at every stage of the innovation process and development. So where this research actually fit in, and where this research is actually considering the impact on society, for example. It's not clear to me that the other four policy windows and the competitive fund have considered those questions. Or we're going back to the smallest window of all, and we're going to fund all the societal challenges in the world with 7 billion. So this is a very first question, which is related to your question about integration, where the integration is going to happen.
Yeah. Sometimes I just think that it's about the society that we want in the future, and we seem to not be thinking about it. And there's another Death Valley there about what we're funding and about what we want for the future. But let me ask you this: what if you could redesign all of this from scratch, this policy window, or all the policy windows? How would you concretely organize SSH in this funding program and instruments?
Well, first of all, society needs to address the core of the challenges for societies. So, issue of democracy and education and so on. And we did prepare a program for our paper, and it's very clear. So, it has to have a real focus on the question on society, because we need a critical mass. This is number one. We need to scale up on the priorities in a way that people doing research, researchers working on these issues can actually line up on creating some cross-border, extremely critical. We forget that this is the part of cooperation, and we need the cross-border critical mass. A little bit what the European Partnership can do. And thanks for Social Sciences and Humanities being a principle in Horizon Europe, for example, we have partnerships like Brain Health who never consider anything but bioscience to say, oh, maybe we need some contribution for psychologists and sociologists, because the health of the brain is not just about the health of the cells. Or we have another partnership in which each has partners, the Sustainable Blue Economy Partnerships. Because part of the blue economy is very much based, for example, on coastal communities. So how do we address this research? So it's really important to scale up, and the partnership can give an opportunity to scale research on similar priorities. So instead of having 100 sociologists working on blue economies scattered around, they can line up around similar priorities and give us some large critical results. So this is point one. So society needs to be for research on society. Then we need society, not just the societal challenges, but no other windows at the societal challenges. We really need to have the challenges across the whole program. Challenges are for the leadership, in the digital leadership, for example. Challenges are for climate change in clean energies. So we needed to address biodiversity as a major societal challenges, but need to be and sit with biodiversity, biotechnology, bioeconomy, for example. So that would allow also an access. But integration research does not stop to the cooperation program. It also concerns the whole discussion around innovation. We're talking about innovation always like we used to talk 60 years ago, in a very mechanical way, in the sense, is innovation something that brings economic growth, that brings money in a very kind of 1 to 3 euros. For every euro invested, we need to recover 3 euros. But there is a massive level of economics that we don't capture necessarily with 1 to 3 euros. And it actually gives back a lot more than that. I give a simple example. Take, for example, the period of COVID, where some people really survived with the social innovation of distribution of meals. Restaurants could live on it. They save money in one way, but they invest the money in distributing to people who could not get out. They allow the people survival. Of course, you don't measure that necessarily on 1 to 3 euros, because the scale is completely different. Innovation in policy, in social policy, for example, saving money is even more important sometimes than making money. And this is something we have no measure at all to calculate. And so our innovation remained very much tied in with 1 to 3 and finish there. And that's the reason why also that's allowed other research questions beyond the strict technical one, for example.
This is the perfect bridge for our next part of the conversation about resilience. But let me just see if I got this understanding correctly from my side. So you would keep the society window with a focus on specific SSH state-of-the-art, going beyond the state-of-the-art in SSH-specific problems, with a smaller dimension, I would say, but then you would integrate SSH across the whole of the other knowledge domains. Let's call them not policy windows, but knowledge domains, and in that way, work towards that integration that we have spoken about in an interplay that would support and create the feedback loops between SSH research and technological research in those specific knowledge domains that you mentioned, the blue economy, energy, etc. Is that a correct understanding?
Absolutely so. It's really critical to do that. And if you think about in the past, the European Commission had something called the European Innovation Platform, technology platform. Now, we never had a platform which actually has been interrogated, being made inquiries, so it's been asked to contribute to what this other technology platform we're trying to do. So we design the programs which have been completely left out, or the research questions that are relevant to not just the acceptance of technology, but actually the interplay in the co-design and the understanding of the needs of society to have a response and to have a constant discussion and dialogue between what people need and maybe what they don't need that they don't know yet, but we need to find that. But we really need to have that interplay in a different place. We also have a very important societal challenges in democracy being one of the most pressing, as well as education, because we know that people, we need to understand better how our European, but also our society globally is changing and how Europe interplay with the rest of the world is play out. We need to understand that in depth. And this is a challenge in its own right. So we need both. And I'm not saying that we need the society of research and social science and humanity everywhere. This is an overstatement, and we never said that in any of our position paper. We need it when necessary. And it needs to be part of a wider scientific community working together. At the moment, for example, we have a fantastic experiment or collaboration on energy, but not so well enough in some aspect. So it's important that we get some feedback from what it works, and especially we're trying to abandon what it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. You have been talking a lot about resilience. Everybody has been talking a lot about resilience. And in an op-ed in Science Business in June this year, you wrote this fabulous phrase: resilience is just survival. What Europe needs is ambition. I love that. Can you unpack that for me?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of talking from the policymakers about a resilient society. We talk about defense, investing in arms and weapons, and society needs to be resilient to that. I mean, yes, resilience is an important element, but resilience is for survival. I mean, I understand that in a context of war, I can imagine how much resilience is being used in Ukraine. But if you talk about Ukrainians, they have short ambitions. They have been talking about definition of their own identity, which is not just about survival the Russian invasions. It's about building their nation, keeping their tradition, keeping their culture's roots. I mean, this is what I call between resilient adapting and resilient. Even we talk a lot of resilience when we talk about climate change. Well, do we need to adapt to be constantly flooded? Well, yeah, to an extent. But don't we need to do something about it? I mean, this is my point. And the same question about one of the major issues for me is we always said that the SSH needed to be so we can make sure that they accept the technology. No, that's the resilience you're talking about. But I think I'm talking about big ambitions. We're talking about technology that responds to people's needs, not something that people need to accept. We need to take mechanisms, legal structures that make it viable and worthwhile, not for people to just accept that something is changing. Yeah, things are changing and people do adapt, do accept to an extent. But what is important here is where our ambition, what kind of society we really want, which is not to adapt, but actually to build. And that's always my point. I really am a bit allergic to the word resilience, I admit it.
Well, as you know, I just came back from a wonderfully intense and deep trip across Ukraine. And it is connecting to what you were saying. They have, I've met with many universities, policymakers, and I kept hearing this phrase, building back better. And at one point, I just asked, look, someone is going to have to explain to me, because I have never heard, is that a policy that you're promoting, the building back better, or is just a concept? And they looked at each other and thought, oh, all right. Yeah, no, it's just a concept, but it's a concept that got generalized. So they are looking at the future. They are looking at doing great things. They are looking at not only about resilience, and they are at war. So if we that are not, well, we are at war in a way, but if we that are not at war cannot have the capacity to look to the future and to the society that we want, then, I mean, how could we be more competitive? And I think here, to sum this up, what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that SSH could be Europe's competitive advantage, especially in an era where legitimacy and foresight matter more, or at least matter as much, as raw innovation?
Well, I couldn't agree more. First of all, European research in social science and humanities is a comparative advantage on the global scale for Europe. In fact, more than 50% of the top best publications in social science and humanities are written by scholars in Europe. So clearly, we're doing well. Someone would say, if you're doing so well, why you complain? So not complaining for sure, but why not using it, this energy? Why not using this knowledge? Why not using this research for the sake of the society we want to design? And we've been talking so much as a society that, we're lagging behind US, we're lagging behind China. Well, we're lagging behind in economic terms, but the society the US has built is very much based on few billionaires, which make the GDP for US going up, and a society which is dying. And now at the moment they're also dying for very common diseases like measles. So it's a really bizarre competition we are trying to win. Are we winning a competition for a better society or for those who have more money in their pockets? And some people will say, well, this is the same thing. Actually, it's not. Because the reason why Europe has among the best standard of living is because we've done different policies. We are not doing what the US has been doing for a long time to allow billionaires to grow exponentially. We're not much concerned about people around. We've been building regulations for a purpose, for protecting our citizens. And we actually do believe in this kind of values. So we really needed to change the metrics in many different ways. So we really need to be ambitious in that and changing metrics. And the whole narrative is now 20 years old about the narrative of beyond the GDP. So not just understanding how much literally euros a country has in its pockets, which not necessarily means that the country is richer. Actually, if you will look at different type of metrics like the social progress index, it looks like the higher the GDP is, the more miserable people seems to be. And we have the same data in Europe as much as we go in US, as much as we go across the world. So the fact that the country has a very high GDP doesn't make a necessary society happy or wealthy. Is critical. So if that's our values, why don't we put the funding where our values are? We have a fantastic, beautiful European policy in this case, in these areas. We got a fantastic investment in social cohesion. We have a fantastic investment in creative societies, but no in research. Why not? One of my arguments earlier was some of the industry cut out of this discussion of the competitive fund. For example, the creative industry. Well, actually, Europe has a fantastic creative industry in music or filmmaking. Does it show any investment in research on that? Nothing. So my understanding of my recommendations, if I have to make one, is let's change the system in a system that is aligned with the type of society we say that we want. I was recently on a workshop on democracy. Fantastic discussion on innovation in democracy. Voting systems, how voting systems should change today, how different changes in population would allow the different system, for example, of expressing your vote, expressing your voice. There's a lot of innovation in democracy. Is there any investment in research on that at the European level? Very little, very limited, as if it's not important. And more importantly, at this workshop, very much a focus on democracy and artificial intelligence. There was hardly anyone from the research community, as if innovation in democracy is not part of the research and innovation endeavor. And this is saying something.
Let me go back to what you've mentioned at the beginning, because do you think that these issues, that Europe plays a special role in bringing these issues to the table? Or is there some kind of expectation that those type of research problems, like related to democracy, for example, are seen as research problems to be addressed at national level?
Well, this goes a little bit on a political side. Do we believe in Europe, or do we believe on keeping very much individual member states as individual member states? And I know we work in Brussels, Ricardo, and we know that obviously we invest quite a lot of our time and effort in believing in Europe. Do we all? Today, Europe is very split. Countries are becoming increasingly more nationalist. We had a country which was at a certain point considered a pillar, particularly in research and innovation discussions of Europe, who did Brexit. And, this makes everybody think how much Europe wants to be Europe and how much Europe is, without losing the identity of the identity of the individual member states. This is a much bigger political question which goes beyond our science policy, although it's tied in with our investment in research and innovation.
Now, I definitely don't want to open that Pandora box in this discussion, but it is a central question that we keep trying to escape. If I read correctly, just to sum up this part of the conversation, you really are defending here in this metrics conversation is to go beyond GDP-centric thinking, of course. And I mean, we all, people that have been discussing this we all agree that is needed. The way forward is just we even know the way forward. We just don't. We just have this barrier to implementation. But what you're arguing about here is strongly in favor is to fund social knowledge as a public good, not just as a functional support to STEM. That's my understanding of your core argument. So let me bridge that with the final part of our conversation, where I would like to begin by questioning, or at least giving you a context. In your, again, going back to your September paper, which is very good, you call for at least 100 million to be invested in making Europe a social data powerhouse. What would that enable that we cannot currently do?
We have a real urge to understand society on a larger scale, and particularly in Europe. At the moment, that most of our data, social data in particular, are collected at national level or Eurostat at some kind of cross-borders parameters. We really need to have the basics of the evidence for the European policy on data. Take migration as an example. We have some migration European policies. But very much migration policies are driven by member states that pull here and there. Understanding the overall picture of migration across borders of Europe is critical. But at the moment, member states collect data on migration with their own parameters, and often they are not interoperable. They're very difficult to use. Another example. We did a while ago, together with ESFRI and together with the Austrian Ministry, a webinar about social data and Ukraine. Social data, Ukraine collected social data, being hosted in a social European infrastructure is critical for the reconstruction, for example. Families are being divided, understand war crimes. These are things that can be done with the research infrastructures at the European level, and not just collected nationally, but with some parameters that are born European. We really need that too. And just not to be too obvious, Trump is cancelling this kind of database. They are terminating funding. He assumed that if we don't know how many poor people there are in around, you don't have to design programs to help poor people. Poverty becomes just a function of society, but you don't need to know about it, so you don't need to design dedicated programs for that. Well,
you also have to live with the consequences of that. If that is the way.
Exactly. But we are not far off. We are not having that kind of sense at the European scale. And that's why we also got such a big divide between some countries and others, because our data are still very fragmented. So we really need it for a big adventure in that case.
I mean, I could not agree more. I saw, and by the way, about the U.S. policy at the moment, just having come back from Ukraine again, I saw how much help USAID as a program has given to Ukraine until a few months ago. And now it dried out. And that is going to make a difference. And Europe has here a window of opportunity to step up and really make a difference. And the example you just given is a very, very good example of how that could be made without a lot of resources, in fact. So, but let me.
Sorry, but the Qatar USAID is going to have a massive geopolitical impact, because many societies across the world have been helped by the USAID in terms of stability, in terms of support, and all these people somehow will react to the missing support. And what the consequence of this could be is a geopolitical instability for obvious reasons. So we are sitting on mines.
Yeah, we're sleepwalking into extremism. And talking about that, let me ask you about governance. In your point of view, and having this in mind, what governance reforms would be needed or are needed in the design of strategic planning and work programs concretely?
Difficult question. If you define it better, the concept of governance, we have at the moment, as you know, the framework program is proposed by the European Commission, which in this case has been a completely very small group of people. Many people in the European Commission say we haven't been notified of anything before the proposal was published, which is bizarre to say the least. And then there is negotiated between the European Parliament and the member states. I have a relationship with all these institutions on a regular basis. And I'm always a little bit baffled about how the process of negotiation happens. Sometimes it's the louder who get heard, or the one who spoke the last. And I don't know if this is the best way to negotiate something that is very critical for Europe, because we have to bear in mind that the European Framework Program is the only budget of Europe which is allocated centrally. It's not given to member states to distribute as they wish. So it has a particularly important, critical role and has to be thought through carefully. So in terms of governance, is a right dynamic to have three parties negotiating with each other. But under these three umbrellas, there are so many actors, and they are multiplied. So for example, in this framework program 10, not only we have the Minister of Research and Innovations in all the 27 countries, we also have now, because the Competitiveness Fund is involved, the Minister of Finance, who knows nothing about what a research investment is. But of course, because of the influence of the ECF, has to have a word, or apparently has to. Also, interestingly enough, some Ministry for External Affairs seems to have an interest now. Because in some sort of ways, all our diplomacy and lots of our diplomacy is science diplomacy and soft diplomacy is very much tied in with what we invest in terms of research and what we keep a secret and what we keep open, who we collaborate with, who we don't. So there's another layer of complexity. And this complexity is also multiplied by 27 countries in some cases. Well, not necessarily 27 of them have the capacity, but for sure is multiplying actors. So the governance, I'm not so sure which governance we are talking about and how to define the governance in this case. It's a constant tool of negotiation and renegotiation. As by experience, we also know the negotiation never ends. Even when the program is approved and the money are given, there have been cases where reopen the box and say, oh, well, this couple of billions we can put somewhere else. And we know that happened in the past, and I'm sure it will happen in the future. So I'm not so sure which governments you're heading to.
Well, that's fair. That's a fair comment. I think that, I think you've dealt with it very, very nicely, beginning by explaining this broader framework of governance between institutions and the interplay, and also this kind of secretism that we have felt along the negotiation process towards FP10, and things coming out with I would say even with short time for comments, and especially in a program which is kind of revolutionizing the way that the funding is going to be implemented. I myself was not sure about what governance I was talking about, because we could have been. I think what I was aiming at was a layer below that one, even though that one is very important. So the layer of, are we going to keep on going with comitology? Are we going to keep on going? What's your view on that? I think that's where I was aiming at. But I think those things are probably technical details that we can't even address at the moment before answering the bigger questions. So thanks for that. I think it was very well answered. I would link that with go on.
If I may, there's also another layer of complexity which is around the scientific community. Mm-hmm. And the ERC is doing a fantastic job in advocacy for fundamental research, which is really critical in this discussion. It goes back to your concept of excellence and how we interact with that. But as a result of that, we have a situation where cooperation, for I have no idea what reason, has been perceived as not delivering. It's quite the opposite. Cooperation has been delivering enormously, just not needed to be counted in terms of patents only. And so this is really an important discussion, because within the governance discussions, there's also the perception of what we are evaluating, how we evaluate things. Many of the reports the Commission does in terms of midterm evaluation, for example, are so... they don't give you an analysis of the data. They give you loads of tons of data these days, but no analysis. So what does that mean? Is 40% higher or 20% less? What does that mean? That we got 10 more patents here and 10 less patents there? I mean, we really needed to address evaluating the current program for the sake of the next one in a much more analytical and critical thinking, and not just collecting numbers. And so if we talk about governance, I would say evidence-based governance.
Well, indeed, evidence-based governance is much needed.
Even in terms of how the comitology has been performing or not, for example.
Or not, I would emphasize that latter part.
Well, let's get the data out. Shall we?
Let's. I think this is something that we can work in the future. Let me link this up with the role of area stakeholders and coalitions between those stakeholders, not only the area ones, but not only the officially recognized area stakeholders, but stakeholders like myself, for example, at INESC, which is a large RTO with a presence in Brussels, like many others. And I would like to hear you about what role should we be playing, and should we be playing in ensuring that these demands are heard? What are your recommendations on that?
Well, definitely we live and breathe the implementation, and this goes back a little bit at the end of the previous conversations. We have the evidence of what it works and what it doesn't to an extent, and all of us in different fields, in different areas, in different interaction of research, in different aspects of the research and innovation process. These are definitely things that can bring to the fore. And also, we have the inside knowledge of the scientific community engaged in this, and not just as a scientific community living alone on a different planet. Sometimes we talk about science and scientists as if they live on Mars and they come and visit occasionally. They are citizens, they're part of our citizenship, and we're all part of this discussion. And we are the one who follow the up and down. And you were saying earlier, we had a few years on our shoulders of been monitoring and visiting this kind of arguments. So we don't have just the right. We have a duty to report back. And I think it's extremely important. And this actually is demonstrated by the fact that the many university alliances and organizations like umbrella organizations like ours are getting more vocal, more present, and pushing the doors and listen carefully and want to be consulted. Not because we want to sit at the table to have a better meal. We want to sit at the table because we can contribute to that meal. And that's something that I'm not so sure policymakers always understand or appreciate. It's not always clear to me to what extent our, for example, issue does a lot of data analysis. I can do more, but we do data analysis. We understand the things from inside. So why not? Why not contribute with what we understand and what we learn, studying the dynamics, or learning over time and these dynamics to contribute to the bigger meal. It's not to have a bigger share.
Let me launch a challenge to finish, to sum up and close up this. I think, and you're free to comment after me, of course, about what I'm going to say. I think that we have all been talking to ourselves in majority of times. We go to any conference or website or webinar. I mean, there is a reason why they call Brussels the bubble, right? Especially this quarter here where we are sitting, and we've been talking to each other. We talk to the converted. And we don't talk to each other in the sense of for example, technology institutes with the SSH oriented organizations. And this conversation needs to happen. That data analysis needs to happen together, jointly, in my point of view. And I think that we are all guilty of not doing it, and probably the programs are guilty of not incentivizing it and the instruments. But I think that as stakeholders, we have a duty of trying to make it happen. And this was in large part a motivation for this podcast. So feel free to comment.
Well, I totally agree with you. I just think that this is not something that each one of us can resolve in isolation. We need to be brought to a table, or we need to actually bring ourselves to a table we set up. The stakeholders of ERA, we went there as an individual organization to sit at the ERA table. The Commission then preferred to have 5 big groups, and they grouped us somehow. We agree and disagree on the grouping. And that's a kind of split a little bit the community in some ways. I totally agree. We need to have a much better front. I remember when we were beginning of the Horizon Europe discussion, we launched a Twitter campaign called Double the Budget all together. We were about 27 associations there. And I think that's the best way to feedback collectively, to agree on the main red lines that we have in common and communicate loud and clear. And we also need to make happen something that we haven't been very good at, as you say, to actually take the initiative of doing that, to create the platforms. We do in the real life, research is very multidisciplinary these days. People work in labs of different backgrounds and find themselves and so on. What we don't do it is in the science policy environment. So the challenges in the science policy environment to report what is actually happening on the ground of our researchers' activities. And I agree on that. We have been a little bit sitting on our own chairs and not reaching out as much as we could have. And another layer to each other, to reach out to each other as much as we could have. And another layer is to reach out to those that invest in research, which is our societies. And that's why actually what you do with your podcast, what other people do with different type of tools, media, I have an enormous respect for people doing not just science communication, but in general communications. So a lot of the research we do has an obvious and direct impact on what the discussions are in the science policy or in the policies in general. So I think we have to do both in both directions.
Let's make it happen.
Let's make it happen. And I have a proposal for you, but I'll do when we finish.
Well, Gabi, thank you. This has been a profound, necessary conversation. I think that too often in research and innovation, we are chasing novelty and we are neglecting meaning, and we fund technology and forget trust, which is so important. We build frameworks, but ignore the frameworks of thought that shape what counts as science or progress or even Europe. How do you define Europe? What this conversation made clear for me is that I don't think Europe needs to fund SSH only. I think it needs to learn from it. And not just to understand where society is going, which is badly needed, but to help it steer wisely, ethically, ambitiously.
I agree.
I think people need that. So thank you so much.
Thanks to you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.